To our discussion on decision making.
So let's just get a nice brief definition out on the table. Decision making is about making choices among alternative courses of action, and it doesn't mean that you have to engage in any action at all. You could decide not to act. The interesting thing is that about half of the decisions that managers make in organizations ultimately fail. So this guy is suggesting that decision making is just as effective as flipping a coin, and unfortunately it seems like the probability does seem to point that direction. But I hope that with a little knowledge about decision making, you can improve your percentage success rate. So let's talk about different types of decisions. First, we've got this idea that there are programmed and non-programmed decisions, right? And programmed decisions are kind of the easy ones. There's a policy in place that tells you how you're supposed to make your decision. And so oftentimes the problem itself is pretty structured. You've run into it before, and that's how you can make a programmed decision about it. The non-programmed decisions are usually about problems that are quite unstructured. You haven't seen it before. And because of that, the people making non-programmed decisions are usually higher levels in the organization. These are the things that we don't have a policy for yet, and we have to figure out what to do in the moment. So programmed decisions happen frequently, and you have rules or policies in place, whereas non-programmed decisions are often unique and require some really careful consideration. When you come into a decision-making situation that requires some deep and careful consideration, you might want to try using the rational decision-making model. So there's basically 5 steps in the model here. Number 1, define the problem. So figure out, what's our current state and where do we want to be? That's basically the simple definition of the problem. Number 2, you identify and weigh your decision criteria. So basically, what are the relevant factors in this decision and how important is each one? Like you weigh them in relation to each other. And then you generate some alternatives, and then you rate the alternatives to decide which one you want to go after. And then finally, you choose the best possible alternative, implement that alternative, and then evaluate the decision. Find out, did the decision resolve the problem or did it create some new problems? And then that might lead you right back into defining a new problem again. So that's why it's a big circle. So I've got an example from my life at PetSmart where we had in 2005 a series of layoffs. The organization was looking to lay off, I think it was about 10% of the workforce at the time. And one of our vice presidents, the vice president who was in charge of small animal, fish, birds, and wild birds, also had the veterinarians that we kept on staff and our quality assurance officer underneath her area of responsibility. And so the veterinarian's job was to make sure that the animals that we had in our stores were safe and well cared for. And the quality assurance guy's job was to make sure that all of our products were safe for the pets that use them. And they were all quite expensive employees, all 3 of them. We had 2 veterinarians and 1 QA officer, and they were all very expensive employees. And what I find, and maybe you guys have seen this in your experience as well, is that senior level managers hate laying people off naturally. It's a terrible thing to have to do. And so they often try to find expensive people because if they're being asked to cut a certain amount of their payroll, then if they cut an expensive person, that means they have to cut fewer people overall. I've seen it happen time and time again. The other people they get rid of is the people they secretly want to get rid of. So at least that's what I've seen in a couple of layoffs that I've been through, is they get rid of the difficult people and they get rid of the expensive people. And so this manager did exactly that. She got rid of the quality assurance guy. Only problem is that about a month or two after he was laid off, we started to realize that we had nobody to manage our quality assurance with our vendors. We had no way of ensuring that the collars and leads and crates and carriers and everything, biscuits, everything that we sold was actually safe for our pet customers. And so the upshot was that the VP had to go back to this quality assurance person and beg them to take their job back. And you can imagine that that person probably used the leverage to negotiate an even higher salary. So thinking about this process, when in the decision-making process do you think the decision-making went awry? And you can go back to the rational decision-making model to see what you think. And then when in the process was the error discovered? When did they figure out that that was a bad decision? So the PetSmart example is a really good example of most decisions in organizations don't always use rational decision-making model. Because if you think that the problem happened in the decision-making model at identifying the criteria and weighing the criteria, you're probably right. Instead of carefully weighing the criteria, like the importance of that particular position to the company, the manager, the vice president, chose to use completely different criteria that didn't really affect the success of the company overall. And then they didn't recognize the mistake until after the decision had been implemented. And they had to face the fact that it was a wrong decision. So unfortunately, if that vice president, I'm sure that she was trying to make a rational decision, but it's hard to make a completely rational decision because we're influenced by biases more than we know. So why doesn't the rational decision-making model get used more? Sometimes you just don't have a very clear-cut problem. Sometimes you just don't have that condition of certainty. You don't know what every possible alternative is going to result in. You have to use your best judgment. And sometimes you just don't have complete enough information to do that. So if you ever come across a decision that's important enough, I would still suggest that you attempt to use the rational decision-making model. And I gave you a practice for your assignment for this topic so that you can practice using it for a hypothetical decision. All of these things that I've been talking about, heuristics and biases in our decision-making processes, are called bounded rationality. And basically what that means is human beings are rational within certain boundaries. We're not completely rational. So we have some limitations, and sometimes we limit our options on purpose because considering every possible alternative is impossible to do. And so we do this thing called satisficing, and maybe we satisfice too quickly. So by accepting that first alternative that meets minimum criteria, we might be missing out on a much better alternative if we spent more time and thought on the decision-making process. So this guy is saying, I trust my gut because our project is too complex for logic and evidence. So on the one hand, that's a bad idea. On the other hand, you can't consider every alternative for every single decision and ever get anything done. So sometimes remembering that good enough is good enough is important to do as well.
Bounded rationality is to compare it to what complete rationality would look like. So if you look at the image on the right, deciding on a car that you decide to buy would be based on all possible criteria for any kind of car that you could ever consider. So this would include not just miles per gallon and performance and safety, but also would include every detail, every possible detail of the car. And then you would consider all cars on all of that criteria before you chose your final car. We know that we don't do this. It's impossible for us to consider every single potential criterion when we're deciding on a car, so we select benchmarks that we care about. And then from those benchmarks, we select a group of cars that have at least minimum standards in each of those benchmarks, and then we select our final car from there.
Another reason why we aren't completely rational in our decision making is this whole idea of heuristics. So we often use shortcuts or rules of thumb so that we can be quick and efficient in making our decision. But unfortunately, these heuristics might result in subconscious biases that are detrimental to our decisions. So I'm going to talk about 3 heuristics: the availability heuristic, the anchoring heuristic, and representativeness heuristic. First, availability. So a question was asked to different respondents: over the past 30 years, which has claimed more lives in the US, tornadoes or lightning? Why don't you go ahead and make a guess yourself? Which has claimed more lives? So the interesting thing is that in most years, on average, people guessed that 46% of people guessed that tornadoes cause more deaths, and 54% guessed that lightning caused more deaths. But in the spring of 2010, they asked the exact same question to a very similar sample of people, and they found that 76% of people said tornadoes and only 24% said lightning. So why do you think that is? If you guessed because there were a boatload of tornadoes in the spring of 2010, you are absolutely right. So tornadoes were available in people's minds because they had been in the news so much during that spring. Just in case you're interested, the actual correct answer is tornadoes. On average, tornadoes cause 75 fatalities per year versus 51 from lightning. The next heuristic we're going to talk about is called the anchoring heuristic. So what I want you to do is look at one of the 2 following slides. So just skip over and pick either one. Don't look at the other slide, and do the activity on that slide. No peeking. And when you get to the slide that you're going to do the activity on, press pause. Okay, so by now you've completed the activity and hopefully you've written your answers down. So if you were in group 1, the first slide, did you estimate a relatively high percentage? And if you were in group 2, did you estimate a relatively low one? If you did, you were influenced by the anchoring heuristic. So basically, these psychology researchers, Tversky and Kahneman, did a series of experiments where they did the exact same thing that I just showed you. They spun a roulette wheel, and anybody who saw the marble land on 65 estimated 45%. And for those who saw a 10, the median estimate was 25%. So fascinating stuff. Even though the respondents knew that whatever number of marble landed on in a roulette wheel was completely random, it still greatly influenced their estimates of the percentage of bullying that happens in our schools, for instance. So this is called anchoring and adjustment. Basically, that starting value, even if it's random, becomes an anchor, and we adjust on either side of that anchor, but we don't adjust too far usually. So this kind of influences our decision making when we say, oh, look at these jeans, they're 25% off, even though they're $200. So we anchor on the 25% off and don't think about the fact that they're still $150. Finally, let's talk about the representativeness heuristic. So consider this example here. Sarah loves New Age music, she reads her horoscope, she enjoys aromatherapy, and goes to a spirituality group. So is Sarah more likely to be a holistic healer or a public school teacher? Get your answer in your head and then click to the next slide. If you guess holistic healer, you're not alone. But it's actually much more likely that she's a public school teacher, given that there are 3.2 million of them in the United States. So this representativeness heuristic is an example of how we base a decision on like a mental picture we have in our head. And often this is influenced by stereotypes. And often it's very inaccurate. So just as a recap, heuristics allow us to make quick and efficient decisions, but they bring with them the potential for subconscious biases, which can lead to poor quality decisions. So being aware of these biases maybe can help us avoid some pitfalls. So quickly, some of the biases, we've got this idea of confirmation bias, which means that we tend to seek out information that confirms the views that we already have. Projection bias is the idea that we tend to believe that other people feel and act the way that we do. And then finally, sunk cost bias is when we decide to continue with an investment that we've made because we've already invested so much time and effort or money, even if the investment is a bad investment and we should really be cutting our losses. So keep those things in mind. Sunk cost bias is especially dangerous, but confirmation bias can be too. If you have an idea that a particular activity or action would be beneficial to your organization, it can be really, really easy to seek out information that confirms that view and ignore the information that maybe conflicts with it, resulting in a bad decision being made. All right, some other forms of decision making. We've got this idea of intuitive decision making where people maybe aren't using conscious reasoning. They're definitely not using the rational decision making process, but they're recognizing patterns in the environment because they've got experience. They've seen it before. So they often picture a potential course of action and they can estimate what the outcome will be based on their prior experience. So if you had to guess, which employees are more likely to use this kind of decision making in sizing up situations? If you said more experienced employees who have been with the company longer, you're probably right. They've been around long enough to see things happen. On the one hand, intuitive decision-making can be pretty effective, and it's certainly much faster than engaging in a rational decision-making process every time. On the other hand, there are potential problems too. What are some potential problems that you think might occur? Here's a perfect example of one. This internal memo at Western Union back in 1878. Western Union used to be the main form of communication through the telegraph. One more model that I want to talk about for decision making is the political model. This is kind of unusual and interesting. So basically, it points out that most decisions aren't made by one person. They're usually very complex and involve a whole lot of folks. And oftentimes you don't have clear information. Oftentimes, different people have different ideas about what the solution or even what the problem is. And so to come to an agreement, managers talk to each other, they gather information, they exchange viewpoints, and they try to reduce uncertainty so that they can come to a decision. So as a result, decisions come about through bargaining, discussion, negotiation among members of different coalitions. If this is starting to sound like our political process, that's why it's called the political model. So a coalition in an organization is an informal alliance among managers who support a specific goal. And so what you might do is think of a coalition as people that are working together for a specific purpose. They're not really, the coalition is not embedded within the organization's formal structure, and the coalition is very fragile. Once the group achieves their purpose, the coalition is likely to break up. So how do they form? There's this thing that's called an S-curve adoption model, and it's appropriate for lots of different kinds of adoptions. So we're going to use it to describe how people decide to join a coalition. And so basically what you've got in the beginning is a founder who has an extensive network of colleagues and is very persuasive at getting people to agree with their viewpoints about what needs to be done. So you can notice that the S-curve has a really slow startup process. It takes a long time to get to even a 20% adoption rate. So the founder has to stick with it for a while and has to really believe in the idea that they have. Over time, as new members decide to join the coalition, the founder has to decide how beneficial those members are and if the cost of having them join the coalition through favors or resources or anything that the founder provides to them is worth the benefits that they can provide. Finally, you reach a point called the joining threshold where people are joining without much persuasion because they can see that that's the way the wind is blowing. So really, the big takeaway here is a coalition needs a founder who can be convincing, has good timing, and knows when to bring the right people on board when they are most needed. If you're interested in considering building a coalition around an idea or a project that you'd like to implement at work, first you want to seek out people that kind of feel the same way you do about it. Then you want to kind of come up with a plan that meets all of your collective interests. So you feel the same way about something, you say, well, why don't we try to do this? And then you kind of build that plan around your ideas. And then you recruit just enough members to get the job done. And why is that? Because you might owe people things for joining your coalition, and you don't want to add people who are too costly compared to the benefits that they might bring. So this chart just kind of shows you the differences between the decision-making models, talking about goals, certainty or uncertainty, information, and what kind of choice is being made. One last kind of decision-making that I'd like to discuss is team decision-making. There's a really cute video of the internship, which is a movie about these two old guys going to work at Google. They're not old because they're my age, but to you guys, they might seem old. And as you go further in this movie, if you've ever seen it, you see the Google team decision-making model on display throughout the movie, and it's quite interesting. So basically, their idea is that the teams make decisions. There's very little top-down decision-making. The team members use rational persuasion to convince each other, data and analysis, they back up their arguments. And the company emphasizes risk-taking and agility and cooperation. And their hiring practices, naturally, because you have to be a really high performer to excel on one of these teams, their hiring practices are really rigorous. So even in a non-Google culture, you and your team can still influence the decisions that are made. So use your influence to manage up and use some of the things that we've talked about with building a coalition, and you can still have some influence over the decisions that are made by your higher ups. So team decision making has some advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are kind of obvious. Some of the disadvantages, though, may not be quite as obvious. So first, it can be very time consuming. Another disadvantage is there's an opportunity for the minority to dominate. If a minority member of the team feels very strongly about something and can be very convincing and loud in the discussions, even though the majority of the team disagrees, that minority still might win the argument. There's very ambiguous responsibility. Nobody knows who's exactly responsible for what, which I'm sure that you guys have experienced in your team projects in the MBA program. And finally, you might feel a pressure to conform, which is called groupthink. So teams have a number of possibilities that they can use if they want to try to avoid groupthink. And groupthink is a very dangerous thing to avoid. So one thing is to use brainstorming techniques, and a really good brainstorming technique to make sure that everybody gets an equal chance to get their ideas on the table is to have people brainstorm individually, silently, by jotting down ideas first. And then, as a group, every single idea gets put up on the board as a possibility. 3 other possibilities to avoid groupthink in team decision making are nominal group technique, devil's advocate, and dialectical inquiry. And this article has a great description of all 3 of these techniques that basically are just using team member roles to challenge easy answers so that the team doesn't fall into conformity. Because everybody knows that that person who is, for instance, taking the devil's advocate role is only doing what they're expected to do. And these techniques can help to avoid groupthink.